work in philosophy of religion and philosophy of cognitive science. And actually my first interest was philosophy of cognitive science. So in fact, all the work that I do in philosophy of religion relates to that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important, given that religious beliefs feature so centrally in philosophy of religion, that we get to the notion about how do we form those beliefs. Mm-hmm. So I think that in philosophy of religion, there isn't enough sort of meta-philosophical reflection about how exactly we get to these beliefs. Mm-hmm. And I've been involved in work on how we form religious beliefs, and particularly about the intuitions that shape certain religious arguments. So mm-hmm. I've recently published a book co-written with Johan de Smet called History of Natural Theology, mm-hmm. where we look at the intuitions that drive arguments in philosophy of religion. Like, for instance, the argument from design. So it turns out that we have teleological intuitions that when you see something complex or something that seems to be complex and functional, that you think it must have a purpose, it must be made for a purpose. Mm-hmm. So that sort of gives the argument from design its push, mm-hmm. why we think that's intuitively plausible. Of course, at the same time, there's a question about why doesn't everybody then think, okay, yeah, the argument from design, it's very clearly there's a designer, not everybody buys into that. So you have to look at mm-hmm. background assumptions that people have, and that sort of colors, the way that they're going to approach these arguments. Mm-hmm. So on the whole, what I'm working on now is experimental philosophy of religion. So experimental philosophy is this recent branch in philosophy that looks more at how do philosophers form certain ideas, and compares this to how other people have ideas. Because philosophers will often say, yeah, this is just the intuition of the folk. Mm-hmm. But then when you actually research that sort of gives a lot of mixed results. Mm-hmm. So I've recently finished a study on religious disagreement, so I'll just give one example mm-hmm. about how do people think about religious disagreement. And very interestingly, the common folk, so these are studies with lay people, they think that religious beliefs are a bit like preferences. Not completely, but sort of like, if these are like preferences mm-hmm. and these are facts, then religious beliefs are somehow halfway. So they think they're not completely fact-like and not completely preference-like. So it's not like, I like broccoli or something, right. and you don't like broccoli, right. So it's not like that. But it's not like, for instance, oxygen is composed of, O
right.
molecules or whatever.
Right.
So that sort of thing is sort of halfway in between. Mm-hmm. But philosophers think of, so these are mainly analytic philosophers that I polled, they think of religious beliefs as really fact-like as scientific facts. It's a really important difference. The only ones who didn't believe that actually were continental philosophers. So they thought that religious belief was more preference-like. Mm-hmm. So that sort of gives us an insight in where philosophers of religion are coming from, and the sort of the views are shaped by their training. And this is what we talked about earlier, about how they have this sort of view about we want to reason carefully and we want to get at the truth, which is really important for philosophers of religion. And this brings me to one critical note that I have with the sea change that was discussed. So the sea change mm-hmm. in philosophy of religion, where basically there was this pushback against non-realist views and saying, look, we can reasonably defend a lot of ideas. That has come a bit at the expense, at the cost of not engaging enough with the richness of religious life as a whole. So for instance, religious rituals, mm-hmm. There is some work on religious rituals by Sarah Coakley and Torrance, but there's really not as much work as you would expect there to be. So, for instance, philosophers of religion, I polled them how much they go to church. And actually, most of them go to church at least weekly. So that's the majority. And so I thought, well, there they sit every Sunday, and they just don't write about that. Why don't they write about the practice aspect of mm-hmm. religion? So I'm sort of feeling that has come at the cost of defending the rationality of religious beliefs. A lot of aspects of religious life that are valuable and important don't get enough attention.
So one of the things I'd be interested to hear more about is, were there interesting differences when you did some surveying of ordinary folks' views on religion as fact claim or as preference, between the account they would give of what religious belief is like, generally speaking, and how they would handle or treat particular religious belief claims, right? So someone might say, I see this in students sometimes, when they're giving a sort of meta theory of religious belief, they're inclined toward a view according to which these are preferences. But when talking about specific claims of religious belief, they treat those as having inferential entailments of the sort that don't follow from mere preferences, that do follow, though, from treating those beliefs as if they were of the sort that are making fact claims.
So that's a great question. And actually the general question about what do you think about religious beliefs? Are they fact like a preference like? That's not the way I asked that. So one thing, I was building on this work by Hatepets and Spelke, and they did the survey with ordinary people. So they asked these things about, Janet thinks that people who die just stay in the ground, whereas Martha thinks that people who die, well, they rise up from the ground. Do you think that they both can be right, or that only one of them can be right?
Right, okay.
So that was the sort of question that was asked,
Right,
always
good.
specific questions. And I asked a question of that form, something like, I forgot, X thinks that there are many gods. No, it was X thinks that there is no God, and Y thinks there is one God. And can they both be right? And so about particular claims, general lay public thinks, I think about 60% or so, if that was a percentage, thinks that they could both be right in these. Whereas with philosophers, it was like 10-20%. I mean, really low percentage. And most of those turned out to be continental philosophers and non-Western, people who studied non-Western philosophy. And also historians of philosophy were more likely to say that.
That's really interesting. Huh. Good.
Could I just ask, does the strategy that you were proposing mean that we should somehow sidestep the question as to whether religious claims are true or false?
I don't think so, but I think it's really important to get clear about, as philosophers of religion and other philosophers, what do we think about? I mean, what are the ideas that we have? What are the background assumptions that drive our thinking? For instance, about whether religious beliefs are preference-like or fact-like. Now it seems very clear that philosophers think that religious truth claims are fact-like, and it's interesting. Why do other people, well, American lay public, why do they think that to a lesser extent? So it's important to get clear on these meta-philosophical questions. And I think one thing to do that is to really get a better idea about, the sort of assumptions that we have and the sort of baggage that we bring into philosophy. And I think that still doesn't exempt us from doing the actual work.
Okay.
So it's not something that I personally do. So hardcore analytic theology is not what I'm engaging in. And I'm hoping that my contribution is to get a better idea about the context in which this sort of debate takes place. But we still need to do that actual work. I think.
With respect to one of the things you said at the beginning, which I found really important, is looking at the history of these intuitions that we have, right? So where do these come from? Why do we have certain intuitions? Why do things just intuitively seem plausible to us, right? So with teleology, we're almost primed to see that as a plausible sort of approach, and you can give a good account as to why that would be. Does that apply also, or ideally does it apply also to the XPhi, the experimental philosophy? Would a complete picture need to look at the history of these intuitions about religious beliefs as truth claims or as preferences? And if so, is this something we should be trying to get a grip on?
I think that that's the sort of thing that came up in our discussion earlier about that. One nice thing about theologians is that they're really aware of this sort of thing about the history of ideas. And philosophers have only very recently done that. And I think that indeed good experimental philosophy has a historic outlook. I mean, one thing I find very worrying, so I've been writing on intuitions, and it seems that now when you work as a philosopher, intuitions are so important. Like, I mean, you give I'm saying something like the free will defense against evil, and these intuitions are really important. But it turns out, so there was a Google Ngram search about the words intuition, and it turned out that there was a skyrocketing starting the 1960s. Everybody was all of a sudden talking about intuitions, whereas before people weren't talking about intuitions that
Right.
much. I mean, if you read Aquinas, he doesn't say intuitively it seems plausible that he just doesn't do that.
Right.
And then you may wonder, okay, what is all this stuff about intuition?
Right.
Turns out that one of the things is that linguists worked about, they use this intuition talk, saying you have a certain phrase and native speakers will see this doesn't seem right, or this is right. And what if, as philosophers, we can use that methodology? I mean,
Right.
what else do we have?
Right.
But I think, in fact, that philosophers of religion have a rich resource. So we both were talking about Athanasius, and I think that is, for instance, an underexplored resource. Like the Church Fathers, I know that some philosophers of religion use them, but probably not as much as they would like, because it is really hard. That's one of the things to learn about this tradition and become good at it.
Can I ask you a very specific question? I'm this relating to intuitions. You mentioned the teleological argument, but as I teach the cosmological arguments, the existence of God, it strikes me that there really are different people have just different fundamental intuitions. I mean, I have a very strong intuition that it's just counterintuitive to think that that there would be something rather than nothing. Now, I mean, if God's a necessary being, of course, there can't be nothing, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Whereas other people don't seem to find it counterintuitive to suggest that there's just a givenness about something existing. Does your work on intuition shed any light on the cosmological argument?
Yeah, so it depends a bit which version. And the version that my co-author and I looked at was the Kalam cosmological argument, which is the thing about everything that begins to exist has a cause, an external cause for its existence. Now, it turns out that intuition really is something that most people have. I mean, that's just something cross-culturally. So people have done these studies with children in Mali who had never seen certain things like tuning forks, and they were sort of like you and you know, they were thinking about how could this happen. I mean, you had a tuning fork that was resonating, and they quickly found out that it was because another tuning fork nearby was struck, that sort of thing. And so people intuitively seem to think that indeed something that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Babies who are put in front of screens and they see things happening, they immediately start looking at what causes this. So really, when you say, well, you know, the universe could be self-existent, it could have caused itself, that's a very counterintuitive claim to make.
So, are you suggesting that your work, your research might suggest that the cosmological argument is just based on a habit of mind, subjective habit of thinking rather than, you know?
In a sense, yes. So it's more than just a habit of mind. It seems to be something, in this case, the causal intuitions seem to be evolved. I mean, they really seem to be something that is part of our cognitive machinery that we, with much difficulty, can turn off. So it's really something that is part of our way of reasoning as human beings.
So do you think that if it can be shown to, you know, evolve this intuition, does that weaken the force of the Kalam cosmological argument?
I think it's very hard to say that, because when you do that, it's going to backfire. All of a sudden, lots of causal claims that you make in science are going to be equally undermined. So that's I think that in fact that particular thing. So looking at the different arguments, I think that with some arguments you could say there's a challenge for cognitive science, but for the Kalam cosmological argument, I don't really see that. I mean, it could be that indeed because things in our environment do happen with external causes, that it seems to be sensible that we have this evolved intuition about causation that seems to work properly.
May I ask a follow-up question on this? So it seems that there's more than one direction that your work could point in, and you might not want to take sides about where it could go, but one approach would be to say philosophers have, in the last 50-odd years, been relying more and more on intuitions to do a certain kind of normative or adjudicatory work, but they ought not to, because these are, they're not, there's no reason to think these are grounded in the way things are, right? This could just be accident of history. So one sort of upshot of your work could be we should be at least more skeptical of normative appeals to intuitions. A different upshot would be something more like the sort of strong objectivity that feminist epistemologists want to defend, right? So the issue isn't appeals to intuitions, but appeals to an unduly narrow range of intuitions as what counts, such that intuitive just means intuitive to a small group of persons. But if you want greater objective purchase, then what you need to do is have a broader sense of the relevant intuitions, right? I mean, there's at least those two. I'm just curious to hear if either of those is where you think this is headed or should head, or neither.
I haven't actually made up my mind completely about this thing. So one thing that I think is that sometimes, so it's important to be aware about the fact that there is this increasing reliance on intuition or explicit appeal. It could be that people used intuitions implicitly, and that's very hard to trace.
Right.
So there is some work, against intuitions. Several epistemologists have said we just cut the intuition talk. But and you can do that, but you're still going to rely on intuitions. So that I think is important, that we are relying on intuitions. That even Thomas Aquinas was relying on intuitions, even though he didn't use the locution. And so then it's important to get clear about where do these intuitions come from. Right. And I think that a lot of early experimental philosophy suggested that there were these big differences, between gender, between cultures. But then it turned out, when people tried to replicate that, and that's of course something general in cognitive psychology, the replication crisis, that it's very difficult to replicate even a strong effect. Right. You try it again and then it's gone. Like, for instance, intuitions between genders. So this is something that you mentioned, feminist epistemologists would say, that would be hugely problematic, but it turns out that actually there are 2 or 3 studies and they haven't found any differences about many philosophical views in intuitions between men and women. So that sort of makes it less unproblematic, because indeed if it's just something like a very narrow group of people have that particular, then you can wonder about truth claims about, aren't we just too unduly influenced? But if it turns out that there's more widespread, like teleological intuitions, causal intuitions, those in my book I've found, actually you see them across cultures, then the perspective shifts and you can see about, okay, do we have any reasons to think that these are reliable intuitions, given our evolved, cognition.
Good. So a lot of what you've been talking about strikes me as really fascinating, and it makes me grateful that there are people doing work like that. It also strikes me that I'm certainly not equipped to be doing that work, so it seems as if I would benefit from a fruitful division of labor, right? Right. Do you see that as a growing trajectory in philosophy of religion, more division of labor, persons aggregating the results of their research in order to, as opposed to Descartes in his room just doing it on his own, but are actually working together more? Do you see more of that in philosophy or philosophy of religion?
Yeah, so there's some work on in feminist epistemology showing that, in fact, if you look even at Descartes, so he had all these discussions with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, and she had all these powerful objections against his dualism, and you see that in later work incorporated. So I think, in fact, that it's only recently that philosophers have started explicitly acknowledging that a lot of philosophy does involve good debate and interactions. And next to that, there's also just the growth, like in philosophy of religion. Someone like Plantinga, the scope of what he did, it's almost unimaginable for someone to do that today because of how the debates have grown. It can't keep up with it. So we need the division of labor also because the field has grown so much.
Are you saying that, how do we adjudicate whether this is just simply part of an evolutionary process, or this might be evidence of a design plan?
Right, so that's a really fascinating question, and that's just a difficulty in, so you're probably aware of Thomas Nagel's recent work about whether, even if there is no, divine designer or something like that, there's still the question about, in his view at least, whether teleology is a reasonable concept to be applying in our reasoning about, human evolution, cognitive evolution, And that's just a really difficult question. So Kant said that teleology was unavoidable, that it was sort of, he didn't really like it, but anyway, it was just unavoidable. And it does strike me as true. I mean, if you look at, I think Michael Cruz made this observation. He said that even if people try to consciously excise talk of teleology, evolutionary biologists, it comes back. Like, this has evolved to do this or that, and you think that doesn't work like that. Mm-hmm. And you have some explicit neo-teleological, views like Karen Neander, who say these things like, you have the idea of function, and then you do bring back the teleological assumptions. So, for instance, our minds function well to deal with, and now I sound teleological, our minds function well, enabling us to do all sorts of things and to work well, to interact with our environment in all sorts of ways. And so even, so you could indeed ask about, okay, if suppose that something like theistic evolution is true, I mean, that's a fascinating question. Then God has designed our minds to think in certain ways, formulate certain arguments, getting to know about him. And that's really fascinating. I think that's something that philosophical theology should explore.
Yes, and of course, one of the interesting things about science, as you know, is that science, all of science, every kind of scientific activity presupposes the intelligibility of the contingent order, right? Now, that's not something that science could ever explain in and of itself. And I think this is where philosophical theology might have something to contribute. Indeed, does have something to contribute.
Indeed,
because it can provide an explanation of that. And I think that goes beyond anything that could be provided by the evolution of intuitions. It is clearly a necessary supposition that attends all scientific activity.
Right.
And from my perspective, I think theistic suppositions, beliefs, make sense of that to a far greater degree than the alternative explanation. But am I pushing too far?
No, I mean, that is definitely something. And I really forgot the title of the book, but I read this book, The Philosopher's God. Do you remember who may have written it? It's a trade press book. Mm-hmm. Do you remember who wrote it? Well,
I don't,
anyway,
but I remember the book.
Well, anyway, the author says, and I saw him in Oxford give this talk about it, and he says that actually without Christian theology, which has this strong assumption about the intelligibility of nature and about, of course, human reason falls short of all sorts of things, but at least we have an intelligible nature that we can comprehend in part, has been really crucial for the development of science as we know it, the scientific revolution. So I agree with that, and I would be more interested to hear more about how you think that. What could be the contribution of philosophical theology in that respect? So could it be something that could interact with some branches of philosophy or science, or how do you see that?
Well, very simply, I think the intelligibility of the contingent order reflects that it's designed by an intelligent being.
Right. Yeah.
I think Richard Dawkins will never be able to provide any kind of account.
No, he'll just have to take it on some sort of, assumption about, let's hope that nature is intelligible and,
Precisely. And one of the things that's so frustrating for me, and this is probably a rant, one of the things that's so frustrating, particularly in Britain, is the impact that the four horsemen of modern atheism have on the British public, right?
Is that so substantial?
Massive. Massive, mediated through the press and so on. And yet there are so many questions that they can't even begin to address. And whereas academic philosophy now recognizes the unparalleled explanatory power of theism, right? Mm-hmm. The way philosophy is represented to the culture by Dawkins and his cronies, would suggest the opposite. And so there really is a need, I think, for what's actually going on in analytic philosophy, and the remarkable conclusions that are emerging to be communicated more widely, disseminated more widely than they are at present.